well, we're in week 2 of our 7-week fall series. We're working with the book Divine Audacity by Reverend Linda Martella Whitsitt, where she dares us to have the audacity to be the light of the world. The world needs us to step up and step out as role models for how to live with a sense of calm patience, deep respect for each other, and a compassionate worldview that's grounded in a sense of optimism and abundance. That's the kind of thing we mean by letting our light shine. The book is about exercising our 12 powers, and the 12 powers is a unity concept that goes way back to the late 1800s, developed by our co-founder Charles Fillmore, that invites us to get in touch with those intangible qualities, our 12 powers, spiritual intangible qualities, which can help us to generate our greatest strengths as human beings. Well, we call them spiritual, again, because they are intangible. They're not reducible to any physical process that we know of. And there are certainly more than just 12, but these are the ones that can help us to open the door, so to speak, to open the door to what is possible for us. So these are the 12 that get us started, the ones that help us to live a life that's focused on the true, the good, and the beautiful. And our mission here is to help people to thrive from a spiritual perspective. One of the ways we do that is by promoting spiritual growth, the development of spiritual intelligence. So working with these spiritual abilities is one way to help us to do that. So today we start with the powers of faith and understanding. I have to say, faith has been a tough one for me on the spiritual path, because for a long time I was a part of the Mark Twain school when it came to the word faith. You know what Twain had to say about faith, right? Faith is believing in something you know ain't so. He had a way of cutting through to get to the core of things, didn't he? And I'll tell you, you know that I was raised Catholic. And so growing up, I was required to believe all sorts of things that I either just knew weren't so, or things that I harbored some pretty serious doubts about. For example, Catholic doctrine, at least back then, said that the wafer and the wine that we received at Mass were the actual body and blood of Jesus. Some of you know where I'm coming from here. Not just symbols, not a metaphor, but the physical body and blood that had been, and the word they used was transubstantiated, right? Transubstantiated by the priest. The substance had been transformed, but you couldn't do anything to verify it. If you took the consecrated bread and the wine, and you weren't supposed to do this, but if you did, put it under a microscope, they would look just like bread and wine. And as I say, if you did that, you'd be accused of desecration. Well, I never got it. It made no sense, and eventually I had to say, you're asking too much of me. You're asking too much of me. You're asking me to give away my powers of reason and observation. I might have been perfectly happy with it being symbolic or metaphorical, but that choice wasn't open to me. By insisting that it could not be a symbol, they drove me away, and I joined the Mark Twain Club. Faith is believing in something that you know ain't so. Now, I know there are people who would say, well, what's the harm, right? What's the harm believing in something you know isn't true, or maybe have some doubts about? Well, back in 1874, this guy here, William K. Clifford, wrote a book called The Ethics of Belief. This is the guy who said, it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. That's a pretty strong statement. He wrote a whole book on the subject, and he used a story in the book, an allegory really, to illustrate this point. And I'm going to share the story exactly the way he wrote it back then, using the language from back in the late 1800s, which may sound a little bit different to us today, but here it is. A ship owner was about to send to sea an emigrant ship. He knew that she was old and not over well built at the first, that she had seen many seas and climes, and often had needed repairs. Doubts had been suggested to him that possibly she was not seaworthy. These doubts preyed upon his mind and made him unhappy. He thought that perhaps he ought to have her thoroughly overhauled and refitted, even though this should put him to great expense. Before the ship sailed, however, he succeeded in overcoming these melancholy reflections. He said to himself that she had gone safely through so many voyages and weathered so many storms that it was idle to suppose that she could not come safely home from this trip also. He would put his trust in Providence, which could hardly fail to protect all these unhappy families that were leaving their fatherland to seek for better times elsewhere. He would dismiss from his mind all ungenerous suspicions about the honesty of builders and contractors, and in such ways he acquired a sincere and comfortable conviction that his vessel was thoroughly safe and seaworthy. He watched her departure with a light heart and benevolent wishes for the success of the exiles in their strange new home that was to be. And he got his insurance money when she went down in mid-ocean and told no tales. Now what shall we say of him? Surely this, that he was verily guilty of the death of those men. It is admitted that he did sincerely believe in the soundness of his ship. But the sincerity of his conviction can in no wise help him, because he had no right to believe on such evidence as was before him. He had acquired his belief not by honestly earning it in patient investigation, but by stifling his doubts. That's the story. What's the harm, indeed? That's why we don't want to get in the habit of believing things on insufficient evidence. When we do that, we're practicing being credulous, which is synonymous with gullible or naive. Not good. What's the harm? Sure, we've seen this picture or pictures like it before. Radical Islam tells its followers that if you become a martyr for the cause, God will give you, 70 virgins, 70 wives, everlasting happiness. How about this next picture? Anyone remember a guy named Marshall Applewhite? He led a group called Heaven's Gate. In 1997, 39 of them committed suicide because they believed, sincerely, that their souls would go aboard a UFO that was trailing the comet Hale-Bopp that year. Not just insufficient evidence, no evidence at all, but plenty of people around the world believe that kind of stuff, and we know where that leads. Well, Jesus talked about faith a lot in the Gospels. The word shows up 34 times. And although Jesus never explained exactly what he meant by faith, the Greek word that they use for faith is this one here. The Greek word is pistis, which literally means to be persuaded of the truth of something. So, for me, the best definition of faith gets back to the original Greek. Faith is trusting what we know to be true. Faith is trusting what we know to be true. And of course that leads right into the next question. How do we know something is true? Which is where the power of understanding comes in. They go together. Now we could break the word understanding down into two words, right? It consists of two words, under and standing. So we ask ourselves, what is it that stands beneath a claim or an idea that someone wants us to believe? What is the foundation on which it's based? Is it a foundation of unproven assumptions? Is it a foundation of wishful thinking, untested ideas? Or is there some real evidence that's based on observation, that's based on experience, something that we can test, something that we can verify? Understanding wants us to know those things. Understanding wants us to look for those things so we can know what is true and what can be trusted. That's how faith and understanding work together. Our understanding needs to be all-encompassing. And what I mean by that is we take in information from a whole variety of sources and then we cross-check it. We also want to be aware that there are some sources of information, some ways of going about getting information that are better suited than others in certain situations. For example, I woke up this morning wondering if it was raining hard enough outside to the point where I needed a raincoat or an umbrella, if it was cool enough to need a jacket. Well, I didn't turn within, right, and go into meditation and seek inner guidance, right? I stuck my head outside, for crying out loud, to see if it's raining, to see what the temperature felt like, and maybe I'd check the weather forecast to see what it was going to be like a little later on in the day. On the other hand, there are situations where we have to make a decision. We have to make a decision where we don't have time to gather a lot of evidence. We have to rely on our experience. We have to rely on an inner knowing that is based on that experience. Otherwise, we could be paralyzed. We could be indecisive when the situation calls for action. So the best scenario is when the intellect and intuition work together. We could have an intuitive knowing or a brilliant idea that pops into our head spontaneously, seemingly without conscious effort on our part, but it needs to be tested, it needs to be verified before we call it knowledge, before we say that we know something to be true. One study, one news story, one scientific paper isn't enough. We have to ask some questions. We have to ask, is it a reputable source? Is this source known for being biased? Has this been reviewed by others? Have they duplicated the results? The reason we want to be so careful is because anyone can be fooled. Anyone can be fooled. I don't care how smart you are, how educated, how skeptical we are. We can all be fooled. So don't just rely on one source for news, ideas, and information. If there's a breaking story being reported, I want to see who else is picking up on it. Not just CNN, not just the 3 networks, but how about the BBC? How about Reuters, NPR, Al Jazeera, Der Spiegel, especially if it's something that has a potential international impact. And there's all sorts of sources beyond that. If we don't do that, we're just giving our power away. Otherwise, we're just giving our power away. And even when we're reasonably sure we understand something sufficiently to say that, yeah, we know that that's true, we get back to faith. How often do we know something that we don't trust? Right? Do we really trust what we know to be true? We know that this is an abundant universe in general. This is an abundant universe. The sun provides 10,000 times the energy that we need. And even if our energy needs triple, there will still be more than enough. And we are just beginning to learn how to adequately and efficiently capture that energy. And we're going to get better and better at it. The world is already able to produce enough food to feed every person on the planet. We can do that now. It's not a supply problem, it's a distribution and a communication problem. It's a problem that we're going to have to address with our power of will, which is coming up here in a couple of weeks. If we understand and trust that this is an abundant universe, that there is more than enough, we're going to be in a better position to make the right decisions going forward. I trust the ability of human ingenuity and creativity to find solutions to even the most intractable problems, because we have a good track record of doing exactly that. And history shows that as time goes on, we're getting better and better at doing it. Do we trust that the universe is a place of abundant possibilities and that there is good and opportunity coming our way, or are we going to hell in a bucket, waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? Two very different attitudes. One makes it easier to embrace change, and the other can cause us lots and lots of problems. Pessimism and a bad attitude never led to anything good. Are we looking forward to new possibilities? Or are we whining about how things were better in the good old days? Blind belief and wishful thinking are not going to be enough to sustain us in the long run. We look for a solid foundation for understanding, then we trust what we know to be true. That means, and this is the good news, that means less worry, less anxiety, and a greater sense of optimism and hope grounded in reality. It takes work, it takes practice, it requires our time and our commitment to look at the issues, the claims, and the ideas around us at a deeper level than maybe we're used to. But the message we have to the world is that everyone can do that. Everyone is capable of doing that by right of consciousness. You don't need someone else to do it for you. It's a wonderful gift that we all have. It's one of our inherent powers, so let's not give it away. Now, starting this week, we're going to be getting together after the service. Let's say at 11:30, we'll meet in the youth area if they're cleared out of there. And if you have any questions, or if we just want to sit down and discuss these ideas, we can do that. And we'll do that each Sunday going forward. So that's enough for today. Next week, we're going to be talking about imagination and will. The color, appropriately enough, is pink, which means that we'll have to see how many men have the will to wear pink or the imagination to figure out a way to get it into their wardrobe, right? See you next week.